You may proceed.
Okay. At this time, we are calling the case of the estate of Genesis Petrillo versus Harper Martini and Peony Estates. My name is Judge Jessica Bernard. Scoring judges, please look to the two buttons on the lower left of your screen and remember to keep your audio and video off unless a tournament coordinator asks you otherwise. You should have your video set to hide all non-video participants so that the only people on the screen should be the advocates and myself. I would ask first now that counsel for the plaintiff make appearances.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. My name is Nellie Sun, and along with my co-counsel, Sava Castleberry.
Good morning, Your Honor.
And Juliana Mayer.
Good morning, Your Honor.
We represent the plaintiff in today's case, the family of Genesis Petrillo.
Good morning, counselors. It's nice to see you this morning again. Before we do any pretrial matters for the plaintiff, I would like to ask that the defense counsel make appearances.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Kensington Cotter. Today, I'm joined by my co-counsel, Miss Sophie Klorick.
Good morning, Your Honor.
And Miss Rebecca Steinberg.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Together, we represent the defense in these proceedings, Mr. Harper Martini.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning, everyone. It's also nice to see you all again this morning. At this time, I'd like to take up any pretrial matters. We will begin with the plaintiff.
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff does have some pretrial matters to attend to. First, we'd like to start off by invoking Rule 615, the constructive sequestration of all witnesses barring party representatives. And Your Honor, the plaintiff has no party representative today.
Does the defense have a party representative, Counselor Cotter?
Yes, Your Honor, we designate Harper Martini as our party representative.
Okay. I assume you have no objection to the request from Counselor Sun. Okay, hearing that, we will grant that request. You may continue.
Yes, Your Honor. And next, we wanted to let Your Honor know about a quote board that we're going to be putting up throughout today's trial with things the defendant has said. Because we're going to be constructing this throughout the course of today's trial, we ask that it be shown constructively outside the view of the witnesses and towards the jury, if that's okay with Your Honor.
And did you say it's a, I'm sorry, did you say a cork board?
Yes, Your Honor. It's going to be an online exhibit, a quote board with things the defendant has said.
Okay, a quote board. I thought
Yes,
you said cork. I thought you said cork board. I thought, okay, is that the new techie thing I'm not aware of? So, okay, is there any objection from the defense regarding that request?
No objection to the quote board, Your Honor.
Very good. Your request regarding the quote board will be granted.
Yes, Your Honor. Next, we'd like to draw the court's attention to a stipulation. Specifically, Stipulation 3, which says that Exhibits 1 through 10 have all been pre-admitted, and they can be used during opening statements.
Very good.
Next, Your Honor, we wanted to let you know about a case law that's called Midlands Television Studios versus Kozak. This case law says that in lieu of submitting an entire deposition into evidence, a party may instead elect to read parts of that deposition onto the record, as long as the entire question and answer are right.
Very good. Is there an, can you, I know you've given me a snippet of that. Is there, does that case law specifically provide directions regarding any objections that may have been present during the deposition?
Yes, Your Honor, that case law says that all of what we read from the question and answer are still subject to the Midlands rules of evidence. So everyone can still make objections for it.
Very good. Thank you, Counselor Soon.
One last thing, Your Honor, due to the online nature of today's trial, we're going to be putting up exhibits so that witnesses can authenticate them constructively outside the view of the jury, if that's okay with Your Honor.
That will work well for the court. I would just ask if there's any confusion that you just clarify when you are screen sharing whether or not it's being shared just with the bench or whether or not you're intending to share it with the jury at that time.
Of course, Your Honor. And with that, the plaintiff is ready to proceed.
Very good. Thank you, Counselor Soon. Counselor Cotter, are there any pretrial matters for the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. First, we'd like to clarify for the convenience of the court that the plaintiff has brought a civil claim of battery against Harper Martini in his individual capacity. And secondly, Your Honor, we'd like to invoke Midland's Rule 603, which constructively swears in all witnesses prior to their testimony. Your Honor, we also expect throughout the course of this trial that we will be using the screen sharing function to display exhibits, the quote board like Ms. Sun just mentioned, and other demonstratives. And we just like to ask for your preferences. Do you want us to ask permission before we do so, or should we just go ahead and put them on the screen?
I am fine with you going ahead and sharing the screen. I assume if the other party has any objection to that, they will notify the court. If you could just note for the record that you are screen sharing. There's no need to note who's doing it. I just assume it's happening in the virtual sky. But if you could just note for the record that you are screen sharing, that would be preferable. And I think things will move quickly and efficiently in that manner.
Yes, Your Honor, we will note that for the record. And also, Your Honor, we just like to bring the court and counsel to the pretrial order for battery. I'm going to share my screen right now with that order. So, Your Honor, this is the pretrial order for battery as decided by Judge Frank Yaluza. And we just like to specifically look at that second paragraph, this highlighted portion, which states evidence of Peony Estates pesticide usage and or storage may be admitted by either party if such evidence is relevant to other issues, such as intent and or causation. We just like the court to take notice of this because the defense intends on offering this type of evidence throughout the trial.
Okay, the court takes note. Thank you.
And finally, Your Honor, if connectivity is ever an issue for anyone and you need testimony or questions repeated, please just let us know.
I will do that, and I'd ask that you let me know as well if for any reason you cannot hear me as well. So,
yes, Your Honor, of course. And with that, the defense is ready to proceed to opening statements.
very good. I assume there are no further pretrial matters, so we may begin. You may begin with the opening statement from the plaintiff.
Yes, Your Honor. Before I begin, can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, Counselor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. Listen to the defendant. I'm going to make you disappear. Members of the jury, those are the defendant's words. His name is Harper Martini. And last summer, the defendant's son, Casey Soto, was about to marry a woman named Genesis Patria. But you're going to learn today that the defendant hated Genesis. He was willing to do anything to stop that marriage from happening. So the night before the wedding, the defendant poisoned Genesis, put a deadly chemical in her wine. Within minutes, Genesis was throwing up, falling over, and losing consciousness. Within an hour, she was passed out, falling into a coma, and being rushed to the hospital. For the next morning, Genesis was dead. You see, members of the jury, that's why the plaintiff is pursuing a claim of battery in today's case. Now, that means we have to prove to you, by a preponderance of the evidence, or more likely than not, that the defendant intentionally poisoned Genesis. And we're going to meet that burden today. We'll meet that burden by asking you to listen to the defendant. Listen to what he said before, during, and after he killed Genesis Patria. So first, we'll show you what the defendant said before he poisoned Genesis. You'll hear today from Sam Arnold, the wedding caterer. Mr. Arnold will tell you that he saw the defendant in the kitchen before that wedding, holding two things: a bottle of wine for Genesis and a canister of deadly pesticide. When Mr. Arnold asked the defendant what those pesticides were for, he said they were for Genesis. And members of the jury, we're going to show you that the defendant followed through on those words, because the bottle of wine the defendant gave Genesis was tested. Those tests found a lethal pesticide called isofenfosemide. And Jim Kwan, Ms. Petrio's doctor from the ER, will tell you that he found that exact same pesticide in Ms. Petrio's stomach. And finally, members of the jury, we'll show you what the defendant said after he poisoned Genesis. You'll hear today from Angel Rodriguez, the maid of honor. Ms. Rodriguez will tell you that she was the one who took Genesis to the hospital that night, after everyone else went to sleep. But when she got back to tell everyone what happened, the defendant already knew. Before Ms. Rodriguez could say a single word, the defendant said, "Genesis got poisoned? I guess we'll have to cancel the wedding." See, throughout today's trial, members of the jury, we're going to make it easy for you to keep track of all the different things the defendant said. Each time we hear one of the defendant's statements, we're going to put it on this list. And as this list becomes longer and longer, the defendant's intentions will become clear. See, members of the jury, Genesis Petrio's death wasn't an accident. It was planned. And it was a tragedy. You're going to hear a lot of people talking throughout this trial, but nothing any of us can say will change that. Nothing any of us can say will bring Genesis Petrio back. But there is one thing we can do. Listen. Listen to the defendant, because he'll tell you exactly what he did. That's why, at the end of this trial, we'll ask you to find the defendant liable. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Counselor. Is there an opening statement from the defense at this time?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
This case isn't about one bad bottle of wine. Members of the jury, this case is actually about a bad batch of grapes. It's June 7th, 2019. Harper Martini takes the stage at his son's wedding rehearsal dinner. He presents his daughter-in-law to be, Genesis Petrio, with a bottle of 2019 Cara wine. And with this gesture, he hopes to mend his broken relationship with Miss Petrio. Members of the jury, the evidence will show that Mr. Martini had no idea that that bottle came from a bad batch of grapes. He had no idea that the grapes that made that wine were accidentally contaminated when they were on the vines in his vineyard. Genesis Petrio's death was a tragic accident. Now, the plaintiff has the burden to prove its claim of battery against Harper Martini. That means that they need to prove to you that Mr. Martini intended to poison Genesis Petrio, and that poisoning led to Miss Petrio's death. But members of the jury, the plaintiff won't be able to meet their burden of proof today, because that contaminated wine that Genesis Petrio drank, well, that came from a bad batch of grapes, not from one bad bottle of wine. As the defense, we don't have a burden to prove anything to you today. But throughout today's trial, I do want you to pay close attention to two important aspects of the evidence that you'll see today. Now, one is the fact that Mr. Martini was trying to mend his broken relationship with Genesis Petrio. And the other is how the winemaking process at Peony Estates produced a bad batch of grapes in 2018. Now, Mr. Martini will take the stand today and he'll tell you how he tried to fix his relationship with Miss Petrillo. He'll admit he and Miss Petrillo didn't always get along. But before the wedding, he realized they had to get along in order to keep his family together. Now, the family's wedding planner, Blair Osborne, will describe the moment when Mr. Martini welcomed Miss Petrillo into his family. He'll tell you how Mr. Martini got up on stage in front of everyone, gave Miss Petrillo that bottle of wine, and made it clear that he wanted her in his family. You're also going to hear from head winemaker Austin Lewis how Peony Estates' winemaking process could have produced a bad batch of grapes in 2018. Now, Miss Lewis will explain that every year, Peony Estates has to throw out a portion of their grapes because they get overexposed to pesticides. But members of the jury, the evidence will show that in 2018, no one threw those poisoned grapes away. The evidence will show that that 2019 Cara wine that Genesis Petrillo drank came from that bad batch of grapes. Mr. Martini will tell you that when he gave that wine to Miss Petrillo, he believed that the bottle and the batch that it came from were perfectly safe. In fact, he'll even tell you that selling that brand of wine to the public was crucial to the success of his business. Members of the jury, throughout today's trial, the evidence will show that what happened to Genesis Petrillo was a tragic accident caused by a bad batch of grapes, not by one bad bottle of wine. That's why at the end of this trial, we'll ask that you find Mr. Martini not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Klorick. Would the plaintiff like to call their first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Ms. Angel Rodriguez.
You may proceed.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Angel Rodriguez.
What do you do for a living?
I'm a kindergarten teacher. We're just now getting back to in-person classes, so it's been really nice seeing the kids again.
Ms. Rodriguez, could you tell us why you're here today?
Genesis was my best friend. I was with her the night she died.
I need to ask you some questions about Genesis. How did the two of you meet?
At a karaoke bar, actually. I got up on the stage to sing I Want to Dance with Somebody, but I forgot all the words and everyone was staring. And then Jen came in. She sang the whole song with me. We even came up with a little dance, and ever since that night, we've been really close.
Do you know her fiance, Casey Soda?
Yeah, of course. Casey, Jen, and I, we spent a lot of time together.
Do you know the defendant, Harper Martini?
Yeah, that's Casey's dad. So he was going to be Jen's father-in-law.
I want to talk about Genesis and Casey's wedding. Where was it supposed to take place?
At Peony Estates. That's the winery that Harper owns. I was the maid of honor, so I did a lot of wedding planning there with Harper, Jen, and Casey.
How did the planning go?
It was pretty rough, actually. Harper and Jen, they'd argue a lot. Harper would insult Jen all the time out of nowhere.
What would he say to Genesis?
He'd call her names, say that she was a problem, that she was toxic. One time he yelled that he hated how close Jen was to Casey.
Well, I want to talk about the day of the rehearsal dinner. Did you hear the defendant and Genesis argue that day?
Yeah, they got into another fight. Harper said, he said, leave and save this family the headache. Otherwise, I will make you disappear.
Miss Sun, could you put that on the quote board? Did you see the defendant after that fight?
Yeah, right before dinner, I saw him walking towards the kitchen holding this canister that said bug off pesticide on it.
Did you ask the defendant about that canister?
Yeah, I did. He said, it's for Genesis because Genesis is such a pest. I just stared at him and then he said he was kidding.
Ms. Rodriguez, when was the next time you saw the defendant?
At the end of the rehearsal dinner, after all the speeches, Harper gave everyone in the wedding party a bottle of wine.
Did you see what type of wine the defendant gave Genesis?
Yeah. It said Cara. It was a different brand from everyone else's.
Did you see Genesis drink that wine?
Yeah. Harper poured her a glass right after he gave it to her.
All right. So I want to talk about how Genesis was acting before and after she drank that wine. Do you remember how she was beforehand?
She was normal. Genesis. She made everyone cry with the speech to Casey and then made sure everyone tried out the dessert bar. I mostly remember that she and Casey they couldn't stop smiling at each other.
How was Genesis acting after she drank that wine?
Within an hour, she was totally out of it. She could barely stand. She was slurring her words. I'd never seen her like that before. It seemed like something had to be really wrong.
Did you try to help her?
Yeah, I took her to her room, but she got worse. She started vomiting and sweating and burning up, and her face turned all red. I tried to get her to drink water, but she kept on throwing it up. I really had no idea what to do, so I called 911.
Well, did anyone come and help?
They tried. Some EMTs came and did CPR on Jen, but she wasn't waking up, and so they told us that we had to get in an ambulance and go to the hospital.
What happened at that hospital?
They put Jen on a stretcher and they rushed her into the ER. I thought maybe I should go get Casey, but I couldn't. I couldn't just leave Jen there alone. So I waited. I waited the whole night in the hospital. It was the longest night of my life.
Ms. Rodriguez, could you tell us what happened in the morning?
A doctor came out and he told me that Jen was in a coma. I knew I had to tell Casey.
Well, did you go and tell him?
Yeah, I rushed back to Peony Estates. Some people were still putting up wedding decorations. But while I was looking for Casey, I ran into Harper.
Did the defendant say anything?
Yeah. Before I could catch my breath and tell him what happened, he said, Genesis got poisoned. Oh no, we'll have to cancel the wedding.
Ms. Rodriguez, I want to be very clear here. Before the defendant said Genesis got poisoned, had you told him what happened that night?
No, I hadn't said anything about poison. I hadn't even told him that Jen was in the hospital. I hadn't said a single word.
And ma'am, before I let you go, I want to talk about whether wine from that rehearsal dinner could have been made from bad grapes. Did other people drink Peony Estates wine that night?
Yeah, Harper gave everyone in the wedding party a bottle of Peony Estates wine.
Did you see anyone else get sick that night?
No, I didn't.
And since that night, have you heard about anyone from that rehearsal dinner getting sick from that wine?
No, just Jen.
Thank you, ma'am. We don't have any more questions.
You may proceed with cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Ms. Rodriguez. My name is Kensington Cotter, and I just want to say that on behalf of Ms. Klorak, Ms. Steinberg, and myself, we are incredibly sorry for your loss. And now, if you need a moment before we begin, please just let me know, okay?
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I want to start by talking about June 7th. Now, like you said, you were at the rehearsal dinner that night, weren't you?
Yeah, that's right. The whole wedding party was there.
And while you were there, Ms. Rodriguez, you had an alcoholic drink, right?
Yeah, that's right. I had a cocktail and a shot after.
I want to be specific about what you drank that night. So you started with an alcoholic drink, didn't you?
Yeah, a cocktail, if that's what you mean.
And then you had another,
That's right.
and then another alcoholic drink, right?
Yeah, that's right. I had a shot.
Ms. Rodriguez, that night you had so many drinks that you actually lost count of just how many drinks you had. Isn't that right?
I wasn't really keeping track. That's right.
So you can't tell the members of the jury the number of drinks you had that night, right?
No, I'm sorry. I wasn't keeping tabs.
And after you lost count of how many drinks you had, Ms. Rodriguez, you kept drinking, didn't you?
No, I had the cocktails and the shot. That's it.
You even had some of the wine from Peony Estates, right?
No, I took a sip of the wine, but I spit it out.
Well, Ms. Rodriguez, after you lost count of those drinks, those cocktails, those tequila shots, you were drunk, weren't you?
It's possible. Yeah, I had a bit of a headache.
Ms. Rodriguez, you know that night you were drunk, weren't you?
No, I'm not sure. I had a bit of a headache. I was nauseous.
Well, you say you're not sure, Ms. Rodriguez. I want to be clear. The next morning, you actually weren't sure if you were hungover or still a little drunk from the night before. You would say that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, that's right. It was a crazy night. I had a headache.
So I want to be clear. On direct examination, you said that you saw Genesis Petrillo acting strange. But that was after you lost count of how many drinks you had, right?
Yeah, that's right. After she was drinking the wine, she could barely stand. I didn't know what was wrong.
And that's when you said you took Miss Petrillo to her room, right?
Yeah, around midnight.
And you went with her to the hospital, didn't you?
Yeah, she started vomiting and the EMTs came, but they couldn't wake her up, so they took us to the hospital.
And you told us that you stayed with her there all night long, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I should have gone to go get Casey, but I thought Jen would be okay.
Well, then after you stayed with her all night long, you actually went to go back to Peony Estates in the morning, right?
That's right. That's after the doctors told me that Jen was in a coma.
When you got back to Peony Estates, Miss Rodriguez, it was 8 a.m, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
So, Miss Rodriguez, you didn't sleep at all that night, did you?
No, I was waiting up for good news, but it never came.
And after you stayed up all night and went back to Peony Estates, that's when you said that you saw Harper Martini in the hallway, right?
That's right. That's when he asked me, he told me that Jen had been poisoned.
Miss Rodriguez, it was after you stayed up all night, and while you couldn't tell if you were hungover or still a little drunk, That's when you interacted with Mr. Martini in that hallway. Isn't that right?
That's right. I remember because it terrified me that he knew that Jen had been poisoned.
Miss Rodriguez, I'm just asking if it was after you stayed up all night and while you couldn't tell if you were hungover or still a little drunk, that's when you saw Mr. Martini that morning, right?
That's right.
Well, I want to rewind back to June 7th, back to before you got drunk. Now, you saw Harper Martini give Genesis Petrillo a bottle of wine, right?
That's right. The Cara wine. He said, "This is just for you."
Well, I want to paint the scene for the members of the jury. So Harper Martini, he was standing on stage, wasn't he?
That's right. He stood up for a toast.
And he was giving a speech, right?
Yeah, he did.
To the entire wedding party, wasn't he?
That's right. It was,
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of personal knowledge to whether or not Harper Martini was giving this speech to the entire wedding party may be heard.
Yes.
Your Honor, Ms. Rodriguez can answer whether or not she heard that speech, whether she saw other people around her. But right now, this question as phrased is beyond Ms. Rodriguez's personal knowledge. She can't speak to whether or not this speech was actually for everyone there that night. She can only speak to what she saw and what she heard.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Ms. Rodriguez has already testified that she was actually there. She saw Harper Martini on that stage. She was part of the wedding party. Under 701, this is a rational lay witness opinion that if Mr. Martini was on stage talking to everyone there, then he was giving a speech to the entire wedding party. Opposing counsel's argument goes to the weight, not the admissibility of this evidence.
The objection's overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. So, Ms. Rodriguez, we were just talking about when you saw Harper Martini up on that stage. Now, he was giving a speech, wasn't he?
that's right. He was giving a toast.
And he was holding that Cara bottle of wine in his hands, wasn't he?
Yeah, he gave it straight to Jen.
That's right. You saw him give that bottle to Genesis Petrillo in front of everyone, right?
Yeah, he poured her a glass.
He poured her a glass in front of the entire wedding party, right?
That's right. It was at the event.
Ms. Rodriguez, when you saw Harper Martini give Genesis Petrillo this bottle of wine in front of the entire wedding party, you never heard him say, "Drink this when you're alone, Genesis." Did you?
No, he just said, "This is just for you."
When you saw Harper Martini give Genesis Petrillo that bottle of wine in front of the entire wedding party, you never heard him tell the rest of the wedding party, "Everyone, don't drink from Genesis Petrillo's bottle of wine." Isn't that right?
No, I didn't hear that.
You never heard Harper Martini warn Casey, his own son, "Casey, whatever you do, don't drink from that bottle." Isn't that right?
No, I honestly wasn't paying attention to Harper.
Ms. Rodriguez, you certainly never saw Harper Martini put pesticides in that bottle of wine. Isn't that right?
No, of course not. I would have stopped him.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. Thank you for your time. Your Honor, at this time, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Counselor Cotter. Is there any redirect, Counselor Mayer?
No redirect, Your Honor. We just ask that Ms. Rodriguez can be excused.
Thank you, Ms. Rodriguez. You may be excused. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
The plaintiff may call their second witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Dr. Jim Kwan to the stand.
Very good. You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Please introduce yourself to the jury.
Hello, my name is Jim Kwan.
Dr. Kwan, what do you do for a living?
I'm the chief toxicologist at River Valley Hospital here in Midlands.
What do you do as chief toxicologist?
I diagnose poisoning cases and their potential causes. A lot of people think that a doctor's job stops at just fixing you, but a key part of handling poisoning cases is understanding what caused the poisoning. My 5-year-old niece calls me Mr. Doctor Detective.
Can I just call you doctor?
Of course.
Doctor, where'd you go to school?
I got my BS from Georgia Tech and my MD from Chapel Hill. My specialty is, of course, in medical toxicology, or the study of poison and its effects on the body.
How are you involved in today's case?
I treated Genesis Petrillo on the night that she passed. I was asked to come speak about her condition that night and her cause of death.
Well, doctor, I want to talk about how you reached your diagnosis for Genesis Petrillo. Did you see her when she first came to the hospital?
I did. After EMTs had brought her into the emergency room, my team and I began our standard workup to see what was wrong.
What did you notice about her then?
Well, when she first arrived, she was vomiting, nauseous, and slurring her speech. She also told me that her chest felt tight. My immediate reaction was that this was a standard case of alcohol poisoning. But soon, her symptoms began to appear more consistent with pesticide poisoning.
Doctor, how can you tell whether someone has pesticide poisoning?
Well, that's a good question. We have three key indicators: pupils, pulse, and pesticide, that tell us if someone is suffering from pesticide poisoning. Our hospital has a chart that we use to teach residents to make that distinction, and I've better modified that chart to reflect Ms. Petrillo's condition.
Your Honor, permission to display Dr. Kwan's PowerPoint? Opposing counsel has seen this prior to today's trial.
Granted.
Dr. Kwan, what are we looking at here?
The chart illustrates the triple P method. Like I said, those three P's stand for pupils, pulse, and pesticide. If all three align, you have yourself a case of pesticide poisoning.
Okay, so let's talk about that first P. What did you look for here?
So we start by looking at the patient's eyes, specifically their pupils. If you ingest a pesticide, your pupils will contract because pesticides cause contractions in the eye muscles.
Did Genesis have contracted pupils?
Yes, Ms. Petrillo's pupils were contracted. The symptom consistent with pesticide poisoning.
What about that next P? What does that stand for?
That next P stands for pulse. Here, we measure our patient's heart rate and see if there's anything abnormal. Pesticide poisoning causes the pulse to slow because pesticides tighten the blood vessels, restricting blood flow to the heart.
Did Genesis have a slow pulse?
She did. Ms. Petrillo's pulse was abnormally slow. That slow pulse is again consistent with pesticide poisoning.
Doctor, can you tell us more about that third and final P?
Of course. That third and final P stands for pesticides. Here, we take blood and vomit samples from the patient and test to see if any pesticide compounds are present. Those other symptoms are pretty helpful, but it's this testing that's definitive. If a patient has pesticides in their body, we know they're suffering from pesticide poisoning.
Did Genesis have pesticides in her body?
Yes, she did. We ran some tests and discovered the presence of pesticides.
So doctor, based on the triple P method, what's your diagnosis for Genesis Petrillo?
Genesis Petrillo had pesticide poisoning because all of her symptoms match those three Ps.
Doctor, a moment ago, you mentioned that you ran some tests on Genesis Petrillo. I want to take a closer look at those tests. Doctor, is this one of the tests that you were talking about?
Yes, it is.
Let the record reflect that we're displaying Exhibit 6 that's already been pre-admitted to the jury. Doctor, what does this test show?
The test showed that isofenfos, a kind of pesticide, was found in Ms. Petrillo's stomach.
Did you try to find out how those pesticides got into her stomach?
I did. I reviewed the statement of Angel Rodriguez. She said that she saw Ms. Petrillo, and only Ms. Petrillo, drinking from a bottle labeled Cara. And now, later, the police sent me results of a test they conducted on a Cara wine bottle they found at the scene.
Doctor, is this that test that you were talking about?
Yes, it is.
Let the record reflect that we're displaying Exhibit 10 to the jury, which has also been pre-admitted. Doctor, what does this test show?
That exact same pesticide in Ms. Petrillo's stomach, isofenfos, was also in that bottle of Cara wine.
Doctor, you mentioned that the same type of pesticide was found in both that wine bottle and Genesis Petrillo's stomach. Are there other types of pesticides out there?
Of course, there are plenty of different kinds of organophosphate pesticides. As you can see, it was the same kind of pesticides found in her stomach, and in the bottle.
Doctor, did you end up treating Genesis for pesticide poisoning?
Yes, I did. I administered an antidote, but unfortunately, pesticides are particularly lethal, and we were too late. She slipped into a coma and passed away the next morning.
So, doctor, what's your final conclusion for Genesis Petrio's cause of death?
That it was pesticide poisoning. She had all of the hallmark symptoms. There were pesticides in her body, and there were pesticides in a wine bottle that matched the description of the wine that she drank.
Thank you, doctor. No further questions.
Thank you, Counselor Sun. You may proceed with cross-examination, Counselor Steinberg.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Now, Doctor, as a toxicologist, you've worked on pesticide poisoning cases before, haven't you?
Of course.
And outside of being a medical doctor, you're also a part of an organization that discusses the effects of chemical pesticides, aren't you?
That's right. I am.
Doctor, it's fair to say that you have a general familiarity with how chemical pesticides are used, right?
That's right. Here in the United States, pesticides are most commonly used in produce farming, things like that.
And because of your familiarity with their usage in produce farming, it's also fair to say you have a general familiarity with how chemical pesticides can be dangerous, right, Doctor?
That's right. As a toxicologist, I deal with the dangers of chemical pesticides often.
And Doctor, when you say they're dangerous, you're not just talking about intentionally poisoning bottles of wine with chemical pesticides, are you?
That's right. I've seen intentional cases and I've seen accidental cases. For example, it's pretty common for a fruit or vegetable to be sprayed with pesticides while it's being grown. If it's not properly washed, I've seen a couple accidental cases like that.
Right, Doctor. Your work talks about the needless dangers of chemical pesticides. Isn't that right?
That's right. We're an advocacy group that actually advocates to remove the use of chemical pesticides. They're quite risky in the United States, and we see cases of intentional and accidental poisoning quite often. So we want to eliminate those risks.
Doctor, I'm not asking about any sort of intentional poisoning here. You're talking about the needless dangers of chemical pesticides, correct?
That's right. Chemical pesticides are dangerous, and I believe they're needlessly so.
And Doctor, one of these needless dangers is that humans can actually accidentally consume small amounts, right?
Of course.
And those small amounts, Doctor, they can be deadly, can't they?
That's right. When pesticide is consumed in small amounts, it always has the potential to be deadly. Of course, the more you consume, the more likely it is that it kills you. But even in small amounts, it can absolutely be dangerous.
And Doctor, like you said, one of the potential needless dangers is that humans can accidentally consume small amounts from the crops they consume that are sprayed with them, right?
That's right. If pesticide has been sprayed on crops and they haven't been properly washed before consumption, you can be accidentally poisoned.
Doctor, grapes are a crop, aren't they?
Yes, ma'am. Grapes are a crop.
I want to ask you about what you can't tell us in today's case. Doctor, you never stepped foot on Peony Estates, did you?
No, ma'am. I never have.
You never spoke to Harper Martini, the owner of Peony Estates?
No.
You never spoke to the estate's winemaker, Austin Lewis, did you?
No, ma'am. I've never spoken to Austin Lewis.
You can't tell us how they use their pesticides at that winery, can you?
No, ma'am. I'm sorry. I don't really have any familiarity with how Peony Estates uses their pesticides.
So you certainly can't tell us, Doctor, if they have a preventative process for protecting accidental consumption of pesticides on their grapes, can you?
No, ma'am. I wouldn't really know about their preventative process. I can say that as long as they wash their grapes and are safe with their wines, they should be fine. However, I have no idea if they do that or if they don't.
Doctor, you mentioned on direct examination your triple P method and the toxicology report that confirmed pesticides in that Cara wine. But I want to talk about two things that both of those can't tell us. Now, that method and that toxicology report, they both can't tell us when that Cara wine was contaminated with pesticides, can they?
No, ma'am. I couldn't tell you. I know it was contaminated, obviously, before Miss Petrillo drank it, but I don't know anything besides that.
Right, doctor. For all you know, they could have been contaminated way back during that harvest. You just don't know, right, doctor?
That's right, ma'am. I'm not sure.
And the other thing that triple P method and the toxicology report can't tell us is how that car bottle became contaminated with pesticides. Isn't that right?
That's right, ma'am. It's a little outside of my expertise to determine who poisoned the bottle or how it got poisoned. That's more for a police officer or for a detective. I'm really just here to talk about the poisoning and how it got into Miss Petrillo's system.
Right, doctor. For all you know, it could have happened by an accidentally contaminated bad batch of grapes. You just can't tell us, right, doctor?
I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm not really sure.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. At this time, Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Counselor Steinberg. Is there any redirect examination?
No redirect, Your Honor. We just asked this witness be excused.
Very good. It looks like Mr. Kwan had a patient. He's already left us. So thank you both, and plaintiff may proceed with their third witness.
Apologies for the delay, Your Honor. Just getting my camera set up. At this time, Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Sam Arnold to the stand. May we proceed? Yes, Your Honor. Can you introduce yourself to the jury?
Sure. Hello, my name is Samuel Arnold.
What do you do for a living, sir?
Well, by day, I'm a private caterer, weddings, birthdays, retirement parties, things like that. By night, I create goat merchandise. This is one I made for my goat, Kroshka. Look, I don't know if this is allowed, but if literally anyone wants to buy goat mug, call me. I have 1,000 of these. I put my number in the chat after we finish.
Thank you for that, sir. Let's focus on your day job. How did you become a caterer?
It's a family business. My father started it. I've worked my way up from busboy to sous chef to CEO of the company. Some people tell me it's a nepotism, but to be honest, I don't know what that word means.
Sir, how did you become a caterer?
Well, I just told you. It was a family business.
Right, sir. Well, how did you become familiar with Harper Martini, the defendant in today's case?
Well, Harper hired me to cater a lot of events at her winery. I love Harper. She gave me lots of money.
Did he have you cater his daughter's wedding in 2019?
Yes, he did.
While you were preparing for that wedding, did Harper ever talk to you about Genesis Petrillo?
Yes, literally all the time. You know, I try to talk about important things like the kind of silverware we will use or the pickled fish we will eat. But Harper always just talk about Genesis.
All right, sir. Well, I want to fast forward to the day of the rehearsal dinner. What happened when you arrived?
When I got there, Harper, he pulled me aside and said he wanted to talk to me about some special bottle of wine.
Your Honor, we're now displaying Exhibit 2A and 2B, and these have been pre-minted. Mr. Arnold, is this that bottle you were just talking about?
Yes, it is.
Mr. Arnold, what did Harper say about this bottle?
Well, he said it is a special bottle with a unique label and that it is just for Genesis. That I have to give it to Genesis when I give out wedding gifts at the rehearsal dinner.
Well, sir, what did you do after that conversation?
I went to the kitchen. You know, we had 5 courses to cook: roasted beets, jellied beets, grilled beets, beets puree. You know, all 6 of my chefs were running around putting things in the oven.
When was the next time you saw Harper?
A few minutes after I get there, you know, Harper here ran in holding that bottle of wine. He said it was for Genesis.
Harper say anything when he came in?
Yeah, he told us we all need to leave. He said he need the kitchen to be empty.
How did you respond?
I say, kitchen cannot be empty. You know, cow's tongue will get overcooked, cabbage will char, it will be a disaster.
What did Harper say?
He say he don't care. The kitchen has to be empty so he can prepare wedding gifts.
So, Mr. Arnold, what did you do?
Boss tell me to leave. I leave.
Sir, before you left, did you notice if Harper had anything else with him in the kitchen?
Yeah, he was holding a bottle of wine, and he had this big can that say a bug off pesticide next to him.
Well, sir, I want to talk about whether Harper said anything about that wine and that pesticide. Can we get the quote board on screen? Sir, did Harper say anything about that bottle of wine?
Yeah, when he was telling me about the gifts, he said, I want to give Genesis something special that will take care of our problems forever.
Did he say anything about that canister that said pesticide on it?
Yeah. I asked him what the pesticide was doing there in the kitchen. He said it was to kill pests like Genesis.
Well, sir, when you left Harper in the kitchen, that canister that said pesticide and that wine, to your knowledge, was he alone?
Yes, I cleared out my whole crew. It was just him.
Mr. Arnold, did you ever give Genesis that bottle of wine like Harper told you to?
Yes, at the rehearsal dinner, I'm giving out wine bottles, and Harper was following me around until I gave the bottle to Genesis.
Did Harper say anything to Genesis when you gave her that bottle?
Yeah, Harper, he leaned into Genesis and he say, this wine is just for you. You should wait to drink it when you're alone.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold.
Thank you.
Your Honor, we have no further questions.
Cross-examination, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Arnold.
Good afternoon, Mr. Clarek. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Now, on June 7th, you gave Miss Petrillo a bottle of wine on behalf of Mr. Martini, is that right?
Yeah. Harper was kind of following me around until I gave it to him, like a goat might follow another goat that it likes.
You knew that other guests at that wedding rehearsal were receiving bottles of wine as well, right?
Oh, yes. He made that very clear. Everybody else gets some different kind of wine, and then Genesis gets this special Cara bottle. Yeah.
And that different kind of wine that you mentioned, that was a 2017 Horizon wine, right?
That's right.
And so the wine that Genesis Petrillo received, that was a 2019 Cara wine, correct?
Yes, that's right.
Now, Mr. Martini actually insisted that you give that bottle of wine to Miss Petrillo, correct?
Yeah. He said I should give it to Genesis, and I should give all the other bottles to the other wedding guests.
He didn't just want you to give that bottle of wine to Genesis. He wanted you to give that bottle of wine to Genesis in front of everyone at that rehearsal dinner. Isn't that right?
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation may be heard.
You may.
Your Honor, opposing counsel's question asked Mr. Arnold to speculate. Specifically, she asked him about what Mr. Martini wanted. She can ask Mr. Arnold about what Mr. Martini said, perhaps. But to go into the mindset of Mr. Martini, well, Your Honor, that's speculation.
Do you have a response?
Yes, Your Honor. I'm asking Mr. Arnold about what Mr. Martini wanted in terms of the instructions that he gave to Mr. Arnold himself.
May I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, that's not how opposing counsel phrased her question. Specifically, what she asked was, Harper Martini wanted you to give that bottle of wine in front of the whole wedding party or in front of everyone. That question specifically calls for Mr. Arnold to testify about what Mr. Martini wanted. It asks him to speculate, Your Honor. It's not admissible.
Because I do not have the benefit of a court reporter, I am going to. Counselor Clark, can you repeat for me what your question was?
Yes, Your Honor. I asked if Mr. Martini wanted Mr. Arnold, based on his interactions with him, to give that bottle of wine to Genesis Petrillo in front of the whole wedding party.
I'm going to sustain the objection just for the sake of moving forward. I think we're going to have another question on the record and then an answer. So I will sustain the objection. I remember the question slightly different than that, but again, without a court reporter, it's a little difficult for me. So Ms. Klorak, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly.
You're all right, Your Honor.
Thank you. Thank you, even if you're being generous to me. Why don't you just go ahead and ask the question again? To have a ruling, I will sustain that. And then Counselor Castleberry, you're more than welcome to re-object if you think the follow-up question warrants that. So you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Arnold, Harper Martini didn't just instruct you to give that wine to Genesis. He actually instructed you to give that wine to Genesis in front of the whole wedding party. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right. I was a bit annoyed. I had a lot of things to cook, but Harper say, you have to go around, you have to go in a circle, do some kind of pattern and give it to Genesis.
Well, despite being annoyed, Mr. Arnold, you did follow Mr. Martini's directions, didn't you?
Yeah, of course. Like I say, I do what the boss tells me.
Mr. Martini watched you give that bottle of wine to Miss Petrillo, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Objection, Your Honor. Lack of personal knowledge may be heard.
You may.
Your Honor, opposing counsel just asked this witness whether Miss Martini was watching him while he gave this bottle of wine to Genesis. He can testify to what he saw Mr. Martini doing, but while he was giving that bottle of wine to Genesis, he wasn't doing anything else. He wasn't focused on what Mr. Martini was doing. This question calls for a lack of personal knowledge, Your Honor.
Have you heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
If Mr. Arnold did not see Mr. Martini watching him, then he's free to say so, but he did answer my question, yes, and that he did perceive Mr. Martini watching him.
Anything further, Mr. Castleberry?
Yes, Your Honor. Again, Mr. Arnold can testify to his personal experience, but he can't testify to what Mr. Martini was doing, whether he was watching him, the other things that Mr. Martini was doing at that rehearsal dinner. Your Honor, that's a lack of personal knowledge. It's what Mr. Martini was doing, not what Mr. Arnold was doing.
The objection will be sustained.
Motion to strike?
Yes, Your Honor.
Granted.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Arnold, when you gave that bottle of wine to Miss Petrillo, Mr. Martini was still in the room, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right.
Now, you mentioned that Mr. Martini said that Genesis should drink that bottle alone, but isn't it true that Mr. Martini told you to uncork that bottle of Cara wine?
Yeah, that's right.
And in front of everyone, you saw Mr. Martini actually pour a glass of that wine for Miss Petrillo, right?
Yeah, I saw Harper pour the glass. I see Genesis drink the glass. I don't see anyone else drink the glass.
That's right. You didn't see anyone else at that rehearsal dinner drink any of that wine.
That's right.
Now, before June 7th, you had never seen that 2019 Cara wine bottle before, had you?
No, I hadn't.
In the lead up to the rehearsal dinner, you certainly never saw Mr. Martini with pesticides and wine, did you?
No, just that night in the kitchen.
But Mr. Arnold, you've certainly never seen Mr. Martini actually mix pesticides into any bottles of wine, isn't that right?
No, that would be freaking crazy. I would have told you that already if I see it.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Clark.
Thank you. Is there any redirect examination, Counselor Castleberry?
None, Your Honor. Thank you. We just asked that Mr. Arnold be excused.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. You may be excused.
Thank you,
Have a nice
Judge.
day.
Have a nice day.
Anything further from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor. With that, the plaintiff rests its case in chief. Requests a brief 5 to 10-minute recess should time allow.
We'd be amenable to that as well, Your Honor.
Okay, you tell the court, because we are letting you pay attention and be mindful of all loss. Would you like 5 or 10 minutes?
Plaintiff is fine with 5.
Sounds good.
Okay. We'll return in 5 minutes. I'll just ask that a captain or a representative from each team turn on their camera in 5 minutes and inform the court and confirm that everyone is back at that time. And then I'll also verbally check in with all the judges to make sure everyone's back before we proceed in 5.
Absolutely,
Thanks,
Your Honor.
Very good. We'll see you. Thank you.
Your Honor, the plaintiff is here and ready to proceed.
The defense is also here and ready to proceed, Your Honor.
Very good. We do a quick check with the other judges and make sure they have returned, because I'm not quite sure what we would do if they have not. Judge O'Donnell, are you back with us?
I am here, Your Honor.
Judge Livingston?
I am here as well.
Judge McNeely? How about Judge Simmons?
I'm here, Your Honor.
Excellent. Judge McNeely, are you back with us? Glad I checked. This is the first time this has happened. Judge McNeely, have you rejoined us after the break?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, excellent. It looks like everyone has returned. So defense, you may proceed with your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Miss Austin Lewis to the stand. May I proceed?
You may proceed.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Hi there. My name is Austin Lewis.
Miss Lewis, what do you do for a living?
I am the head winemaker at Peony Estates.
How did you get into the winemaking business?
Well, I'm sure it's no surprise that I didn't start out in Midlands. Now, back home, my family actually makes a very famous bourbon. But I learned you can make more than just bourbon in a barrel, and I started out on my own adventure.
How did you end up in Midlands, Miss Lewis?
The South has plenty of great things, but you can be sure that wine is not one of them. So I relocated to one of the best wine producing regions there is, Midlands.
And how did you go from leaving the bourbon industry in the South to becoming the head winemaker at Peony Estates?
I worked as hard as I could, everywhere I could, to learn anything I could about wine. And 5 years ago, I became the head winemaker at Peony Estates.
What are your responsibilities as head winemaker?
I'm responsible for what goes into the barrel, what comes out of the bottle, and everything in between. I oversee every step of creating good wine.
Tell us more about that winemaking process.
The process starts in our fields where we plant, grow, and pick our grapes. Then we move to our wine processing facilities where we crush, ferment, and age our wines. And the process ends when we bottle it up and share it with all of y'all. Luckily for us, Peony Estates is actually built on a hill, which works in our favor for creating some great wine.
Well, let's talk more about that hill you mentioned. Your Honor, at this time, let the record reflect that we're displaying Exhibit 4 on the screen for the witness and the members of the jury, and pursuant to Stipulation 3, this is pre-admitted. Ms. Lewis, what are we looking at here?
This is a map of my winery.
Well, you mentioned that Peony Estates is built on a hill. Is that indicated on this map?
Yes, ma'am. As you can see on the map, we have our elevation markings. So you can see the upper, more flat part and where it begins to slope. So as you can see, we have our buildings placed on the upper, flatter part, and where it really begins to slope is where we planted the vineyards.
And can you point out that sloped vineyard on this map?
Yes, ma'am. As you can see here underlined, it goes down from 660 feet all the way down to 605. And these arrows indicate the direction of that decline.
Ms. Lewis, why did Peony Estates decide to build its vineyards on this slope?
Sloped vineyards drain better, so the grapes at the top are higher quality.
Were there any problems with this sloped vineyard?
Not with the slope on its own, but As you can see at the bottom of the map, we were located near a swamp, which led to a whole host of insect issues.
How did you deal with those insects?
We used chemical pesticides.
Were there any issues with using chemical pesticides in the vineyards?
Yes, ma'am. We found that the pesticide tended to settle on the grapes at the bottom of the slope. Overexposed grapes can be dangerous, which was especially an issue given the type of wines we make at Peony Estates.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion may be heard.
Yes.
Your Honor, the witness just said that the grapes at the bottom of the hill are dangerous because they're overexposed to pesticide. Your Honor, that's an opinion for an expert to make. That's an opinion that has to be based on the actual knowledge of the quantity of pesticide within those grapes, based on medical knowledge of how pesticide affects the human body, and based on expert knowledge of how much pesticide a person needs to consume for it to be dangerous. And Ms. Lewis, she just doesn't have any of that. Your Honor, first, she never tested those grapes, so she can't say whether they're actually overexposed. And secondly, she isn't a doctor or a health inspector, so she can't testify about the specific quantity of chemical that's dangerous for a person to consume. Because of this, that testimony is improper opinion.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
Ms. Lewis is certainly not giving an expert opinion here. Now, she stated that she's the head winemaker at Peony Estates. She's testifying within the purview of her job based off of her training and experience as a winemaker and using these pesticides for several years on this vineyard. Now, opposing counsel's argument goes to the weight, not the admissibility. They can take this up on cross-examination, but Ms. Lewis is certainly allowed to testify to if Peony Estates thought that these pesticides were too dangerous for these crops.
Your Honor, may I respond?
You may.
Your Honor, Ms. Lewis can testify to what she did or what she saw, but the quantity of a particular chemical isn't something Ms. Lewis knows. And because she never took any tests of those grapes, she can't say whether or not those grapes were overexposed. And Your Honor, it defends his entire theory today that Genesis Petrillo died because of a small amount of pesticide. Today, they're not calling any doctor who can speak to whether or not that's true, whether it was because of overexposed grapes or because Harper Martini directly poisoned her. They're using this testimony in lieu of an expert witness to try and assert that those grapes are dangerous, and without medical expertise or the expertise of a health inspector, she can't speak to that.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
Ms. Lewis is testifying as to what this business that she works at, Peony Estates, deems unacceptable. Now, she's saying that pesticides on these crops, when they're overexposed, then those grapes would be bad and should be thrown out. Now, if I may make an offer of proof, Ms. Lewis is not going to go into any quantity of pesticides. She certainly is not claiming that she has any knowledge of that. She's just going to say that Peony Estates finds that certain grapes that have too much pesticide on them should be thrown out. Now, that is a business standard.
Your Honor, may I respond on those grounds?
Yes.
Your Honor, Ms. Lewis is certainly testifying to the quantity of pesticides within those grapes and how it affects a person. To be clear, her testimony was that because those grapes are overexposed, they can be dangerous. Your Honor, we don't have that foundation to say whether or not they were actually overexposed because Ms. Lewis never conducted an actual toxicology test or any test for that matter to actually measure the quantity of pesticides within those grapes. And second of all, Your Honor, her testimony went far beyond a head winemaker by saying that pesticides in this amount, this unspecified amount, would be dangerous for a person. Your Honor, that type of conclusion requires the expertise of a doctor or of a health inspector. Because of that, this is still all improper opinion. It goes well beyond her knowledge as a winemaker.
May I be heard on those grounds, Your Honor?
Briefly, yes.
Your Honor, Ms. Lewis's exact words were, "We consider them to be," talking about Peony Estates. Now, as the proponent of this evidence, we can assure you that we are not claiming Ms. Lewis is an expert. We're not going to be going into the details of any improper expert opinion here. Now, counsel's argument goes to weight, not admissibility. They have cross-examination to deal with that issue if they want to.
The objection will be sustained. I do not recall if the witness answered the question with the word dangerous in it or not. Ms. Cotter, I'm not directing you that you cannot lay some foundation or have her provide some testimony, but I do think having the witness testify that they are dangerous does go beyond her expertise. So the objection will be sustained. And if there's an answer on the record, and I apologize without a court where I don't recall, that answer will be stricken. Ms. Cotter, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Lewis, we were just talking about this sloped vineyard and how your company uses pesticides. Well, could you mark on the map the approximate location of where these pesticides would gather once they're sprayed on the crops?
Yes, ma'am. So we found that the pesticide ran with the water down the hill to the bottom of the slope. It was right here where I've circled in red, the flattest part of the slope with the worst drainage. That's the part we consider to be potentially unacceptable.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion may be heard.
You may.
Your Honor, pursuant to your prior ruling, Ms. Lewis can't testify to the actual quality of these pesticides on these grapes. Your Honor, Ms. Lewis just said that it would be potentially unacceptable. Right now, she's just swapping out the word dangerous that she previously testified to. It's the same exact testimony here, Your Honor, and because of your prior ruling, this is inadmissible.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
This is very different testimony. Now, Ms. Lewis said that Peony Estates finds them unacceptable. The jury can draw their own conclusions from what unacceptable means. We are certainly not saying that that means dangerous one way or another, but Ms. Lewis is permitted within her training in as being a winemaker and her experience to say that Peony Estates finds that these grapes would be unacceptable, and that is completely within the purview of her job.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes.
Your Honor, unacceptable in this case clearly means they're dangerous to consume. Your Honor, if Ms. Lewis, I'm sure, were to elaborate on this, she would say that they're unacceptable to consume. And because of that, this is inadmissible pursuant to your prior ruling. It's still an improper opinion.
I do think that the testimony is slightly different. I think that this witness, I think there is foundation for her to lay the decisions that were made by the vineyard and what grapes they utilized and did not utilize, so long as there's no testimony that in any way would speak to expert testimony regarding danger. I fully appreciate, Ms. Mayor, and I think your comment is well noted that there may be a little bit of play with words here, but I do think she does have some foundation to provide some testimony. And I do believe on cross-examination, at least to this extent, you can cover that in a way that would remove any potential prejudice that you think may exist from this. So the objection's overruled at this time.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, at this time, we're going to preserve this exhibit and take it down. Ms. Lewis, you just said that those grapes around the bottom of the vineyard were deemed unacceptable. So what did Peony Estates do with those unacceptable grapes?
I roped off that portion of the grapes, and we did not include those grapes in our wines.
Did you personally remove those unacceptable grapes?
Well, I sure didn't pick them myself, but I was in the vineyard making sure everything was done right.
When did Peony Estates start removing those grapes at the bottom of the vineyard?
We began the process back in 2016, making the 2017 horizon. And that was the first year we used chemical pesticide. And we've been doing it every year since.
Well, Ms. Lewis, what happened in the year 2018? Did you personally oversee the removal then?
No, I didn't. I actually had a family emergency, had to be out of town during the picking, so I made preparations.
What were those preparations that year?
I put Harper in charge. I told Harper to make sure those grapes were not included with the rest of the harvest that would be used to make the 2019 Cara wine.
Well, Ms. Lewis, do you know if those unacceptable grapes were thrown out in 2018?
Of course, I assumed that they were, but as I mentioned, I wasn't there for the picking, so I don't know.
Once you got back to Peony Estates, were you able to see the vineyard then?
Yes, I certainly was, and I was responsible for the rest of the winemaking process for that year, turning those grapes into the 2019 Cara wine.
And at that point, when you got back, was there any way to tell if those grapes at the bottom of the vineyard were actually thrown out like they were supposed to be?
You'd just be guessing. I mean, if you didn't know the amount of grapes you started out with, you wouldn't know how many were thrown out. It could look like a regular harvest, but you just don't know.
Miss Lewis, that 2018 harvest, what wine was going to be made from that?
Our 2019 Cara wine.
Thank you, Miss Lewis. Your Honor, at this time, I have no further questions.
Cross, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Ms. Lewis. On direct, you told us about grapes at the bottom of that slope. And I want to talk about whether or not those grapes are actually dangerous.
Sure.
Ma'am, you've never ran a toxicology test on the grapes that you throw out every year?
No, ma'am, we didn't measure the pesticides. We actually measured the amount of water that sat on the grapes. And those grapes were sitting in about 2 inches of water year round. The water that had the pesticide in it, of course.
Ma'am, I'm not asking about any water. You've never run a toxicology test to see if there are pesticides in the grapes that you throw out every year, right?
We didn't.
So you don't know the quantitative amount of pesticide on those grapes?
I couldn't tell you the exact amount, just that I wouldn't feel comfortable serving that wine.
And ma'am, like you said, you've never made wine from those grapes.
No, that was part of our process when we started using chemical pesticide. We made sure to keep those grapes out of the harvest.
So if wine was made from those grapes, you couldn't tell us how much pesticide was in that wine.
I couldn't tell you the exact amount, but I would consider that to be a bad batch of wine. I would not serve that wine.
Ma'am, that's a yes to my question. You wouldn't know how much pesticide would be in that wine if it was made from those grapes.
I can only imagine.
So then I want to talk about whether those grapes were thrown out. Before you had that emergency in 2018, you told Harper to throw out those grapes.
Yes, ma'am. I like to be the one in charge, but I had to pass it over to Harper for that one task.
You would say he agreed to do so without complaint?
He certainly did, yes.
Then when you got back, the total harvest was what you expected based on prior years.
It varies widely from year to year, but it looked about right to me.
It was what you expected, right?
It was within the range I'd expect. There was no alarms going off in my head.
And ma'am, when you got back, Harper never came to you and said, "Sorry, I forgot to throw those grapes away"?
No, certainly not. If I heard anything like that, I would have had to address the situation.
And ma'am, certainly none of your employees came to you and said, "Miss Lewis, we forgot. We didn't throw those grapes away," right?
No one said either way. No one really talked to me about that process.
That's a yes to my question. None of your employees told you the grapes weren't thrown away?
That's right.
So I want to talk next about how much the defendant knew about pesticides. You said on direct that you're the one who handled the pesticides, right?
I certainly am, yes, although all of my staff undergoes a mandatory annual training, so everyone knows what's going on.
But the defendant also had access to those pesticides.
Yes, most of my staff did, just for regular usage.
The defendant specifically had access,
I believe so.
The defendant told you that he knows these pesticides are dangerous, right?
My entire staff knows that we take pesticide usage very seriously.
In fact, the defendant told you about an incident with an employee who drank a glass of wine contaminated with these pesticides.
That's right, and just a little amount of pesticide was almost deadly in that case.
Ma'am, I'm not asking about the amount of pesticide, but the defendant told you that he couldn't tell the wine had pesticide in it.
Exactly. No one even knew the wine had pesticide in it. That was what was so scary about that.
The defendant told you he couldn't tell there was pesticide in it.
That's right, and the employee certainly couldn't either.
So that employee drank some of that wine.
Yes, he did.
The defendant told you after the employee drank some of this wine, he got sick and almost died, right?
That's right. It was very serious.
Ma'am, after this incident, the defendant said, I know pesticide can be poisonous and fatal, right?
Pesticide is poison and it should be treated as such. That's absolutely right.
Those were the defendant's word, that pesticide is poisonous and fatal.
Yes, ma'am.
Miss Sun, could we get that on the quote board? Okay, Miss Lewis, so let's discuss what the defendant told you about Genesis. The defendant told you that he and Genesis didn't get along. Yes?
That's right.
The defendant told you, I hate Genesis because Genesis is a bad influence on Casey.
That's right. He seemed to think that Genesis had a bit of a drinking issue and, he didn't want it rubbing off on his son.
Ma'am, I'm not asking you about what the defendant seemed to think. He said, I hate Genesis because Genesis is a bad influence on Casey.
That's right. He thought she was a bad influence.
The defendant told you multiple times he wanted that wedding to be called off. Yes?
Initially, yes.
He told you he wanted the wedding to be called off?
At first, he did. That's right. Then he had a little bit of a change of heart and decided to host the wedding himself.
Well, ma'am, Genesis never did call off that wedding.
No, no one called off the wedding.
Later, the defendant said if I could push a button and make Genesis disappear, I would absolutely do it. Do I have that right?
He said that once.
Thank you, ma'am. Nothing further.
No redirect examination, Your Honor. May Ms. Lewis be excused?
Yes. Thank you, Miss Lewis. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
May we proceed with our next witness, Your Honor?
You may proceed.
At this time, the defense calls Mr. Blair Osborne to the stand. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi there, my name is Blair Osborne.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Osborne?
I run an event planning company called Bliss by Blair Events. We do all kinds of events: weddings, birthdays, bat mitzvahs, funerals, seances, adult baptisms, powwows, and quinceañeras.
Mr. Osborne, how exactly did you get into the event planning business?
I've always been a planner. When I was 16 years old, I planned my mom's wedding to Brad, and then her wedding to Michael, and then her wedding to Brad. Again, they all came out so nicely. I realized I had a talent.
So then, how did you make that talent into a business?
Well, in 2011, when my mom divorced Brad and married his sister, Elizabeth, I thought I should charge for my planning this time. And then Bliss by Blair Events was born. But I wasn't really a business until I partnered up with Peony Estates.
Could you tell us when you first partnered up with Peony Estates?
That was in 2015 when I met Harper Martini, the owner of Peony Estates, and we started a fabulous business relationship.
Well, since 2015, how many events have you planned with Peony Estates?
I've probably planned around 80 events at Peony Estates, and most of those were weddings.
Now, Mr. Osborne, when was the last wedding that you planned at Peony Estates?
Well, that was in June of 2019 for Casey Soto, Harper Martini's son, and Genesis Petrillo.
How was planning for that wedding?
At the beginning, it was just like any other wedding, pure chaos. When you bring two families together, everyone bickers over their ideas of the perfect wedding.
Did Harper Martini and Genesis Petrillo ever bicker?
Of course, in-laws always bicker. At first, it was whether we should have eggshell tablecloths or mauve pink tablecloths, and then it was whether we should serve ribeye steak or Parmesan chicken, and on and on and on. It's my job as a wedding planner to mediate all this conflict into a cohesive vision.
So then, during these instances of conflict, Mr. Osborne, did you ever hear Harper Martini threaten Ms. Petrillo?
No.
During these instances of conflict, did you ever see Harper Martini hurt Genesis Petrillo?
No, I did not.
Objection, Your Honor, to improper character evidence, if I may explain.
Yes, you may, and I would just ask that you remind the court the question that was asked just prior to your objection.
Of course, Your Honor. The question that was asked to this witness is, did Harper Martini ever hurt Genesis? And the witness's answer was no. Your Honor, they're saying that because Harper didn't hurt Genesis in the past, she didn't hurt Genesis on the night of the rehearsal dinner. Your Honor, that's improper character evidence.
May I be heard, Your Honor? As the proponent of this evidence, I can assure you that we are not using this evidence for character purposes, but rather to prove intent or motive on the part of the defendant in this case.
Your Honor, if I may respond to that.
You may.
Your Honor, talking about whether or not the defendant hurt Genesis in the past, that's not evidence of motive, and that's not evidence of intent. That's propensity. They're saying that because he didn't hurt Genesis in the past, because he had a general trait of peacefulness or non-aggression, he acted in conformity with that propensity on the night of the rehearsal. Your Honor, that's still improper character evidence.
May I be heard on those grounds, Your Honor?
Yes.
To be a bit more precise, we're using this evidence to show a lack of intent or a lack of motive by giving foundation as to the relationship between the defendant and Ms. Petrillo.
Your Honor, if I may respond to that.
Yes.
Again, Your Honor, in the same vein, talking about whether or not Mr. Martini hurt Genesis in the past, that's not evidence of motive, and that's not evidence of the lack of motive either. That's pure propensity, and it's being used for improper character evidence purposes.
The objection will be overruled.
Yes,
Your Honor. And Mr. Osborne, during these instances of conflict, did you ever see Harper Martini hurt Genesis Petrillo?
No, I did not.
So then, aside from this bickering, how did the rest of the wedding planning go?
Well, once we got all the food, the design, the layout all figured out, well, we transitioned to the rehearsal phase a few days before the big day in early June.
And how was that rehearsal phase?
It went smoothly. Everyone ran their part successfully, and the rehearsal dinner was very special.
Well, what happened at the rehearsal dinner to make it so special?
Well, everyone started giving these cute little toasts, and at some point during Harper's toast, he went into the Peony State cellars and pulled out this big brand new bottle of wine and gave it to Genesis in front of everyone.
Well, now, Mr. Osborne, I want to get a better picture of the rehearsal dinner at this time. Where exactly did Harper Martini give that gift to Genesis?
It was at the stage we have set up at Peony Estates, where the mic is set up, right in front of the whole wedding party.
And who exactly is in this wedding party?
Well, Casey and Genesis, friends of Casey and Genesis, family of Casey and Genesis, and the caterers were there too, photographers and videographers as well.
Now, besides giving that wine to Genesis, did Harper do anything else with that bottle of wine?
Well, he poured Genesis a glass, and Genesis brought that right back to the table along with the rest of the bottle.
Did you see any of the other guests at that wedding drink any of that wine?
I did see Genesis pour a few more glasses after that initial glass, but I couldn't tell you if anyone drank that.
Mr. Osborne, did you see Genesis Petrillo after that rehearsal dinner?
No, that was the last time I saw Mrs. Petrillo alive.
Now, Mr. Osborne, was your relationship with Mr. Martini impacted after that rehearsal dinner?
No, I get along great with Harper. Unfortunately, I just haven't worked with him since the rehearsal dinner.
Did Harper break ties with your business?
No, I had to break ties with Harper.
Why is that?
I had to do it to save my business. Look, I think Harper's a great person, but my clients don't know Harper like I do. And I have to put my clients before my friends. So Peony Estates lost my business.
Well, where are you planning your events now, Mr. Osborne?
I moved all the events I had planned at Peony Estates to other wineries.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. Your Honor, no further questions.
You may proceed with cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Osborne, you told us on direct examination that in-laws always bicker. But I want to talk about what Genesis and the defendant were actually saying. Now,
All
sir,
right.
in May of 2019, about a month before the rehearsal dinner, you had a planning meeting with the defendant.
Yes, I did.
And at this planning meeting, the defendant played a voicemail to you from Genesis.
Yes, that's right.
You'd recognize a transcript of that voicemail.
Yes, I would.
Your Honor, we're displaying Exhibit 8 to the members of the jury. This has been pre-admitted. Now, Mr. Osborne, this is the transcript of that voicemail.
Yes, this looks right.
In this voicemail, Genesis told the defendant that she and Casey were moving away to France.
Yes, that's right.
Genesis told the defendant that he would never see his family again.
Right. Yeah. Genesis sounded, you should have heard the voicemail. Genesis sounded very, very intoxicated during this, and she said a lot of terrible things.
Sir, I'm sorry, I'm not asking about whether or not Genesis was intoxicated. I'm just asking about what Genesis said. And Genesis told the defendant that he would never see his family again.
That's right.
Genesis told the defendant, "You'll die alone at that sad place, and no one will care."
Yes.
Mr. Osborne, after the defendant played that voicemail for you, he said, "One of these days, Genesis will drink the wrong thing." Do I have that correct?
Yes, that's right. Harper sounded, it was incredible actually. Harper sounded very genuinely concerned about Genesis's drinking habits.
The defendant said, "One of these days, Genesis will drink the wrong thing and it will kill her." Is that correct?
That's right. One drink too many can kill you.
Mr. Osborne, I want to be clear. The defendant didn't say, "One of these days, Genesis will drink too much alcohol and that will kill her." He didn't say that.
No, I didn't hear that exactly.
The defendant's exact words were, "One of these days, Genesis will drink the wrong thing and it will kill her." Is that correct?
That's right.
Mr. Castleberry, can we get that on the quote board? I want to talk about what that drink might have been. Now, Mr. Osborne, you were there on the night of that rehearsal dinner.
Yes, I was.
When you got there, Genesis and the defendant were arguing.
Yes, they were. I couldn't hear exactly what they were arguing about, but I did hear that they were in a disagreement.
And sir, in your own words, you thought that things had reached a boiling point.
I did.
But then a couple hours later, the defendant gave Genesis a gift, right?
Yes, during Harper's speech, he went into the P&A cellars and brought out that wine bottle.
That's right, gave Genesis that bottle of wine.
Yes, right in front of everyone. It was such a special moment.
Sir, I understand you're telling us that Harper gave that bottle of wine to Genesis in front of everyone. But I want to talk about what the defendant said. When the defendant gave that bottle of wine to Genesis, he didn't say, "Go and enjoy it with the other guests."
I guess he didn't say that exactly, no.
Well, actually, sir, he didn't say that at all.
No.
The defendant didn't say, "Go and enjoy it with Casey."
No, I'm not sure if Genesis did. Well, she did bring the bottle back to the table, but I guess Harper didn't tell her to do that specifically.
So, sir, that's a yes to my question, that the defendant didn't say, "Go and enjoy it with Casey."
No, I didn't hear that.
The defendant said, "I got this wine just for you." Is that correct?
Yes, it was part of this long speech that Harper gave in her toast, in his toast, and it was so special. I almost started crying.
Sir, I understand that it was really special, but I'm just asking about the defendant's words. And the defendant said, "I got this bottle just for you." Do I have that right?
Yes, that's right.
The defendant said, "I got this special bottle just for you, for when you have a private moment to reflect on everything that you have done."
Yes,
Is that correct?
It was so cute. Yes, that's what he said.
Sir, I'm sorry, I'm not asking about whether or not it was cute. I'm asking about the defendant's words. And the defendant said, "I got this special bottle just for you, for when you have a private moment to reflect on everything that you have done. Do I have that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. No further questions.
No redirect, Your Honor. We just ask that Mr. Osborne be excused at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne.
Thank you.
Have a nice Sunday.
Your Honor, may the defense call their last witness.
You may proceed.
The defense calls Harper Martini to the stand. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hello, my name is Harper Martini.
Mr. Martini, what do you do for a living?
I'm the owner of Peony Estates. We're a small business winery here in Midlands.
Can you tell us how you got into winemaking?
Of course. All of my grandparents were actually winemakers in the Napa Valley in California. And I knew as soon as I was old enough to work that I wanted to spend my life following their footsteps.
All right, Mr. Martini, we've been sitting here all trial, so I want to get straight to the point. Did you intentionally poison Genesis Petrillo?
Absolutely not. It's no secret that Genesis and I weren't the best of friends, but I would never hurt her.
Let's talk about your family. Mr. Martini, are you married now?
No, I used to be. Right out of college, I got married and my wife and I toured the world going to different wineries. Once we had our son, Casey, life felt perfect, but well, Casey was still young and so were we. She got a rare form of cancer and she didn't survive the treatment.
So did you raise Casey alone?
Yes, I did. I was a single dad to a little boy.
Let's talk about your relationship with your son's fiance. Mr. Martini, did you get along with Genesis Petrillo?
Not always. Genesis wasn't a particularly kind person. She would regularly criticize me and everything that our family had created at the vineyard.
How did Genesis criticize you?
She would get drunk and then start bad-mouthing the business to our customers. It hurt to watch my son's fiance act like our life's work wasn't good enough for her.
What about Casey and Genesis's personal relationship? Mr. Martini, do you have an opinion on that relationship?
Of course. I was worried. See, Genesis would sometimes push Casey to do dangerous things. One time, she bet Casey that he couldn't finish a glass of every single one of our vintage wines. And that night, I was woken up from a call from the hospital because Casey ended up there with alcohol poisoning.
Objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 403, this testimony is substantially more prejudicial than it is probative. May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, Mr. Martini just testified about an experience that he had with Genesis, where Genesis pressured Casey into drinking, and Casey almost ended up in the hospital. Your Honor, this testimony is substantially more prejudicial than it is probative. It only serves to prejudice the jury against the plaintiff, Genesis Petrillo. This story about how one time Genesis almost killed someone is not probative. It only serves to prejudice the jury against Ms. Petrillo.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Mr. Castleberry, isn't all the testimony designed to prejudice the jury against the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor, but this testimony is substantially more prejudicial than it is probative, and it meets the bar for 403. Your Honor, Mr. Martini has already testified about his opinion on the relationship between Genesis and Casey. He said he thinks Genesis is a bad influence on Casey. That's enough. The jury doesn't need to hear this extremely prejudicial testimony about Genesis almost killing Casey. That only serves to prejudice the jury, Your Honor.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, throughout trial today, the plaintiff has been displaying quotes from Mr. Martini about Genesis Petrillo. On direct examination, we're going to explain that relationship and what caused Mr. Martini to say some unkind things. This is simply foundational to establish the rocky relationship between Genesis and Mr. Martini. And on direct examination, we're at liberty to establish that relationship. 403 is an extremely high burden, and the probative value of establishing that relationship far outweighs any prejudicial effect.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You
Your
may.
Honor, this testimony isn't probative because we've already heard testimony on the record about their relationship. As Mr. Martini just said, he thinks the Genesis is a bad influence on Casey. Going this step further and talking about this highly prejudicial story where Genesis pressured Casey into drinking, that's not any more probative than what is already on the record, Your Honor. It can only serve to prejudice the jury against Ms. Petrillo.
May I be heard on those grounds, Your Honor?
The objection is overruled.
Yes,
Your Honor. Mr. Martini, what did you see Genesis and Casey do that night?
It was just after Casey's 24th birthday, and Genesis was having some fun. She bet that Casey couldn't finish a glass of every vintage wine. She said that apparently she could. And that night, he ended up in the hospital. I was worried about her influence on my son.
All right, well, we've talked about the relationships with members of your family, so I now want to talk about your business.
Sure.
How does the wine production process at Peony Estates work?
Well, I think you all have actually had a chance to meet my head winemaker, Austin Lewis. She's in charge of the winemaking process. We pick and crush the grapes, ferment and age them in barrels, and then about a year later, we bottle and sell the one wine that we make per year.
Now, you mentioned this harvesting process. Do you specifically handle that part?
No. Ms. Lewis, she's in charge of that. She oversees the vines, deals with the harvest, and also gets rid of the grapes that we at Peony Estates consider to be unacceptable for our production.
Why do you consider these grapes to be unacceptable?
Well, we're located next to a swamp, so we have to deal with the bugs that come with being next to a swamp. So we use chemical pesticides. Part of that collects in the bottom, and Ms. Lewis told me that might be unsafe for us to use that, so we created a policy. We
Objection, Your
don't use
Honor,
that.
hearsay to the statements of Ms. Lewis saying that those grapes could be unsafe.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Yes.
Your Honor, we've already heard from Ms. Lewis today. For the purposes of this witness, we're just using it for the effect on the listener. Ms. Lewis told Mr. Martini to do something, and the process that was produced once Ms. Lewis told her is the effect on that listener today.
Your Honor, may I respond?
You may.
Your Honor, per your prior ruling, we actually didn't hear that the wine and the grapes at Peony Estates were unsafe. In fact, opposing counsel wasn't allowed to talk about how dangerous those grapes were. They were only allowed to talk about whether they're overexposed. And right now, Mr. Martini just said that Austin Lewis told him that those grapes were unsafe. They're now absolutely using Mr. Martini as a backdoor to try to get in these statements that those grapes were unsafe. They're using it for the truth, Your Honor, not the effect on the listener.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
Mr. Martini's specific words to preface this entire answer were what we deem unacceptable. And that is exactly pursuant to your ruling in Austin Lewis's testimony. That danger is not in question here, but whether the process that Peony Estates conducts is the process that Mr. Martini followed up with what Austin Lewis told him to do.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, I'm not objecting to Mr. Martini talking about whether they deemed grapes unacceptable. Per your prior ruling, you said that was allowed. What I'm objecting to is his testimony that Austin Lewis told him that those grapes were unsafe. They're trying to backdoor in this statement because they couldn't get it in on Miss Lewis. They're using him as a conduit for hearsay and to prove the truth of the matter asserted that those grapes were in fact unsafe. Your Honor, that's their entire theory today. We heard it during openings. We heard it during Austin Lewis's direct. Your Honor, it's for the truth.
The objection will be sustained, and the portion of the testimony repeating Ms. Lewis and the comment regarding unsafe, I think that was the exact word, will be stricken from the record. You may proceed.
Yes,
Mr. Martini, you just told us that some of these grapes might be unacceptable. Why might they be unacceptable?
It's because of the way that our vineyard is built. When I bought the land, it had a slope on it, so we had to plant our grapes on that slope. That means that the water runs down to the bottom. It can collect there since we don't have great drainage, and we consider any of those grapes in that bottom area to be unacceptable for our wine production since we have to sell our product. That's why we throw a portion of our grapes away every year.
All right, let's talk about a specific year's blend, Mr. Martini, the 2019 blend. Can you tell us about that vintage?
Sure. The 2019 blend was created from our 2018 harvest, and I had actually dedicated that wine to Genesis and Casey.
Why'd you dedicate it to them?
It's a family tradition. In our family, anytime someone gets married, we dedicate that year's vintage label to them, and we save the first bottle for the couple for their big day.
Did you have a name for this wine?
Of course. We called it Cara wine. The name was actually inspired by Genesis. She used to always call Casey Cara Mia, my beloved in Italian.
Mr. Martini, was this the winery's only blend for 2019?
Yes, we are a small winery. We only produce one wine per year. So for 2019, Cara was to be the face of Peony Estates.
And you told us you made this one bottle for Casey and Genesis. Do you remember when you made that bottle?
Yes, it was early May 2019, just a little over a month before the wedding.
How do you remember the specific month?
It was just before my relationship with Genesis took a turn for the worse. She was screaming in this voicemail that she left me. She sounded drunk and was talking about how she and Casey were planning to move to France and that she would never let me see them or my future grandkids, and that she thought I would die alone and no one would care.
Mr. Martini, I want to be very clear. By the time you received that voicemail from Genesis, had that Cara bottle already been corked and sealed?
Yes, I only filled and sealed one bottle of Cara wine for Casey and Genesis, so I filled it and set it aside a couple weeks before.
What'd you do when you received that voicemail?
I didn't trust Genesis, so I decided I would test her. I decided to offer her $300,000 to see if she would be willing to leave Casey for money. Or I told her I would do it the hard way and tell Casey I couldn't approve of someone he loved.
Objection, Your Honor. Under Rule 1002, best evidence may be heard.
You may.
Yes, Your Honor. Right now, Mr. Martini is talking about a note that he gave to Genesis. And we actually have that note as an exhibit. It's Exhibit 24. Your Honor, under Rule 1002, they're actually required to offer the actual exhibit into evidence. The note itself, Your Honor, is the best evidence. The witness's recollection of the note is not. That's why 1002 requires that they enter this exhibit into evidence, Your Honor.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
You may.
There's actually a specific clarification in 1002. In order for best evidence to be relevant, you need to offer the evidence to prove its contents. Mr. Martini is actually about to explain that what he wrote in that note was not what he meant. So we are not interested in proving the contents of this note today. Therefore, it does not fall under 1002, and plaintiff is welcome to bring that note up if they are looking to prove those contents on cross-examination.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
Your Honor, Mr. Martini has been talking about specific statements from that note. The fact that he was going to give Genesis $300,000, that he was going to take Genesis out of the picture the hard way. Those are statements from that note. And this witness can't just characterize the statements in the note without offering the note for the jury to review. One of the things the witness just said was, I'm going to take you out of the picture the hard way by offering Casey or by telling Casey that I don't approve of Genesis. But Your Honor, the actual statement in the exhibit is just, I'm going to take you out of the picture the hard way. At this point, they're not just talking about what he meant, they're directly characterizing the statements from the note. Your Honor, Rule 1002 requires that they enter this exhibit into evidence so that the jury has the best evidence, not just this witness's characterization of that evidence.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
Opposing counsel actually just made my point by explaining that what was written in the note was not what the defense is looking to prove today. 1002 doesn't just say if we're referencing a quote, we need to bring out the entirety of the document that contains the quote. It specifically notes that you only need to bring that document in if you're looking to prove its contents. Opposing counsel mentioned this characterization of the document that doesn't reflect the language. That's exactly right. Mr. Martini is about to explain that what he wrote is not what he meant. And so we're not looking to prove its contents, therefore it does not fall under the requirements of 1002. If plaintiff looks to prove those contents, they can bring it up on cross-examination.
Response, Your Honor.
Briefly.
Your Honor, the fact that Mr. Martini allegedly didn't mean what he wrote in this note is exactly the point. Rule 1002 requires that they enter this exhibit so that the jury has the best evidence. Again, not just this witness's characterization of that evidence. The fact that there's a contradiction actually goes to Rule 1002, and they're required to enter this exhibit, Your Honor.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
Briefly.
Your Honor, I have 1002 available if you would like to look at the note. Otherwise, we are not offering the note to prove its contents. We're certainly not offering it to prove the contents that opposing counsel is referencing, and any characterization we give actually goes against proving its contents. 1002 does not apply.
Does available mean you're available to screen share?
Yes, Your Honor.
Can you do that briefly?
Absolutely. My co-counsel is screen sharing right now.
Thank you, Counselor, for arguments to both parties. The objection will be overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Martini, you just told us that Genesis left a horrible voicemail and you wrote a note. How is this a test for Genesis?
Objection, Your Honor. Attorney testifying, may I be heard?
Yes.
Ms. Steinberg just said that Harper said that Genesis left a horrible voicemail, but Mr. Martini didn't say that. Opposing counsel is just putting words into his mouth.
Your Honor, may I be heard?
You may.
I believe Mr. Martini said terrible message. If you'd like me to qualify my question with terrible, I'd be happy to do so. I'm just trying to bring the jury back to where we were so that we know what this question is going to.
Okay. I will sustain the objection and you can rephrase the question, Ms. Steinberg. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Martini, you told us that Genesis left a terrible message and you wrote a note. How is this a test for Genesis?
I'm just a small business owner. I don't have $300,000 lying around. I offered her the money to see if she would be willing to take it and leave Casey if the price was right.
Did she take the money?
No. And that made me rethink things. It became clear to me that she really did care for my son, and I knew that I had to talk to Casey about fixing my relationship if I wanted to keep our family together.
Mr. Martini, you just told us about some of the unkind things that you said to Genesis. Can you tell us why you said those things?
Because I was angry and I said things that I didn't mean and that I certainly wouldn't want to repeat.
Did you make amends with Genesis?
I tried. I talked to Casey, and Casey told me that Genesis and I were the most important people in his life. So I decided that at the wedding rehearsal dinner, instead of bringing Casey on stage to present the couple the Cara wine bottle, I would bring up Genesis.
Can you paint the picture of presenting that wine for the members of the jury?
Of course. I got up on stage in front of everyone, and I had my caterer, Mr. Arnold, bring me the Cara wine. I told everyone about our 2019 blend. I even poured the first glass that night. That wine was a way for me and Genesis to fix our relationship, and it was also the introduction of my newest blend to the world.
Did you tell Genesis she couldn't share this wine?
Of course not. All great wine is made to be shared, and the only way we would know if it was any good was if people tried it. That night was the first time that people were going to try the Cara wine.
I want to talk to you about the grapes in that wine. You told us that Cara wine was made from those grapes and no other wine was. Were you in court today when Austin Lewis said that it was your job to throw away the grapes she deemed unacceptable?
Yes, that's right.
Mr. Martini, did you throw away those grapes?
Not personally. I delegated the responsibility to my staff. I personally haven't worked in the fields in a very long time.
Did you at least oversee the process?
Not personally, no.
Mr. Martini, do you know if those unacceptable grapes were ever thrown away?
I assume that they should have been, but I wasn't there, so I suppose I can't say for sure.
Thank you, Mr. Martini. Your Honor, at this time, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Counselor Steinberg. Counselor Castleberry, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Hello, Mr. Martini.
Hello, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. You just said something interesting on direct examination, and I want to ask you about it.
Sure.
You said that your head winemaker, Austin Lewis, told you to throw away grapes in 2018, correct?
That's right. She's normally the one who handles everything that happens out in the field, but she was going to be out of town that weekend.
So you said you asked your employees to throw away those grapes for you, right?
Of course. My back isn't what it used to be. I used to work in the fields back in college, but I don't work there anymore.
Mr. Martini, I want to be very clear about something. None of your employees ever came to you and said, Mr. Martini, we didn't throw away those grapes. We didn't have enough time.
That's right. It's why I don't know what happened and why I can't be sure. I wasn't there.
So that means, sir, none of your employees ever came to you and said, sorry, sir, we didn't throw away those grapes. We forgot.
They never spoke to me about it at all. That's right.
So, sir, none of your employees ever told you they didn't throw those grapes away. Is that correct?
That's right. I didn't speak about the harvest at all after I told them to take care of it.
Now, Mr. Martini, a few moments ago, you told us that you were trying to get a fresh start with Genesis. Is that right?
I was certainly trying. I knew I had to be the adult and try and fix the relationship if my family had a chance.
Let's talk about some of the things you said about Genesis before you came to court.
Sure.
Now displaying Exhibit 18D on the screen. Mr. Martini, this is a voicemail you left for a friend of yours, right?
That's right. An old family friend of mine.
Looks fair and accurate.
It certainly looks right to me.
And it hasn't been changed or altered since you last saw it, sir.
No, it doesn't look like it has.
We offer Exhibit 18D into evidence.
No objections, Your Honor, pursuant to the custodian note attached.
Okay. Exhibit 18D will be admitted.
Mr. Martini, here you tell your friend Genesis is like a cellar pest. Good for nothing. Is that right?
That's right. I was blowing off some steam. We just had an argument.
Mr. Martini, you say you're just blowing off steam, but that's what you said, right? Genesis is like a cellar pest?
That's right.
You said they need to make a Genesis pesticide. I'd buy that. Is that right?
I think I said I'd spend $1 billion on it. It was clearly a bit dramatic, but that's right. I was complaining to a friend about an argument I had.
Mr. Martini, you said, I swear, only one of us will survive this wedding. Do I have your words right?
That's right. I think that was a little while later after Genesis left me that voicemail saying that her and Casey were going to move away and that I'd never see my family.
Mr. Martini, so that's yes to my question. You said, I swear only one of us will survive this wedding.
That's right. It was my biggest fear that our family would be torn apart.
Well, Mr. Martini, let's be clear about the difference between what you said in this voicemail and what you're saying in court today. You didn't tell your friend, I'm worried that our family's going to get torn apart, did you?
That's right.
No, sir. What you said was, I swear only one of us will survive this wedding. Yes or no, sir?
That's certainly how it felt.
Sir, you actually tried to threaten Genesis directly, didn't you?
I didn't threaten her.
Well, Mr. Martini, you remember writing a note to Genesis before the wedding, don't you?
That's right. It was the time I offered her money to see if she would be willing to break Casey's heart.
We're now displaying Exhibit 24 on the screen. Mr. Martini, this is that note that you wrote to Genesis.
Yes, it looks like a photograph of that note.
This photograph hasn't been changed or altered since you last saw it, sir.
No, it looks the same.
And it seems fair and accurate.
I would say so.
Your Honor, plaintiff moves Exhibit 24 into evidence.
No objections pursuant to 801D2, Your Honor.
Exhibit 24 will be admitted.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Martini, in this note, you tell Genesis, I need you out of our lives. Is that right?
That's right.
You say, leave Casey, and the enclosed $300,000 is yours.
Exactly. I needed to see if there was a price that she was willing to put on her relationship with my son.
Sir, let's talk about what this note says if she didn't leave. On direct, you told us that you were going to take Jen out of the picture the hard way by telling Casey you didn't approve of Genesis. Is that right?
Absolutely. When I spoke to her before giving her this note, I told her the hardest thing I would ever have to do is tell my son I couldn't support someone he loved. I wrote that I would take her out the hard way in that note as well.
Mr. Martini, in this note, you didn't write, I'm going to tell Casey I don't approve of you, did you?
That's right. That was during our conversation.
So that's yes to my question. You didn't say, I'm going to tell Casey I don't approve of you.
That's right. I wrote that I would take her out of the picture the hard way. I needed to see what her intentions were.
That's exactly right, sir. What you said was otherwise, I will take you out of the picture the hard way. Isn't that right?
That's right. It's what I wrote.
Then it says you have until the 7th.
Of course, I didn't want my son getting left on the altar. The 7th was the last day before the actual wedding.
Exactly, sir. The 7th was the day of the rehearsal.
That's right. If she was willing to leave my son, she needed to decide before the day they were supposed to be married.
Sir, Genesis didn't leave by the 7th, did she?
No, and thank God for it. I realized she really did care for Casey.
Well, you're saying you realize she really did care for Casey, but let's talk about what you did on the 7th.
Sure.
Mr. Martini, during the rehearsal dinner, you gave Genesis a bottle of Caro wine. Is that right?
Cara wine, but that's correct.
And around 2:30, you got a call from one of your employees, right?
Yes. One of my employees called me because apparently someone had been taken from the estate to the hospital. They didn't know who, but I went around to take a look if anybody was outside and knew anything.
Exactly, sir. They didn't tell you who it was, but you thought it was Genesis, right?
That's right. I've seen her have some problems with drinking too much before, and I saw her drinking pretty heavily that night, so I went to check on her.
Ms. Martini, when you got to her room, Genesis wasn't there, right?
That's right. It was empty.
I want to talk about what you did when you realized that Genesis wasn't in her room and you thought she was in the hospital. Your Honor, at this point, permission to reapportion from the witness's deposition onto the record.
Is there any objection or concern from Counselor Steinberg?
Not for the initial request from Your Honor, but once the deposition is read, I may re-raise an objection.
That would make more sense. I wasn't sure if you knew in advance what portion. Okay, you may proceed, Counselor Castleberry.
Yes, Your Honor. Question. What did you do? Answer. I went to the room where I knew Genesis was staying. Nobody was there, but I saw the bottle of Cara on the floor. It was completely empty. I picked up the bottle, ripped off the label. I couldn't believe that Genesis had managed to find a way to ruin the wedding and threw it into the trash. With that, Your Honor, I have no further questions.
No redirect, Your Honor. We just ask that Mr. Martini resume his seat.
Okay, thank you to both counselors, and thank you, Mr. Martini. You may return to your seat.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor.
And with that, Your Honor, the defense rests its case in chief. And depending on plaintiff's preferences, we request a brief 5-minute recess before closing arguments.
That's fine with the plaintiff.
Okay, we will see you back in 5. Just like last time, please pop your cameras on, or both closing attorneys before we proceed. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
Your Honor, the plaintiff's here and ready to proceed.
Defense is ready to go too, Your Honor.
Excellent. Welcome back, counselors. Let me just confirm all the judges are back as well. Judge O'Donnell, are you back with us?
I am present, Your Honor.
Thank you. Judge Livingston.
I am present as well.
Judge McNeely.
I'm here, Your Honor.
Excellent. And Judge Simmons.
Here, Your Honor.
Very good. You may proceed. Looks like we have Counselor Mayer. You may proceed.
May it please the court. Sometimes you want to believe the best in a person. You want to believe they're not capable of doing terrible things. But when that person tells you who they are, believe them. You see, when a person tells you what they did, how they did it, and why, well, you have to put aside what you may want to believe is true for the truth that is right in front of you. When you hear the defendant say, I want to take care of my problem forever, believe him. When you hear this is to kill pests like Genesis, take him at his word. And when you hear, I will make you disappear, listen. Listen to the defendant. Because the morning after he said those words, Genesis was dead. She died because the defendant poisoned her. That's why we brought a claim of battery against the defendant. That means we had to prove to you that it's more likely than not that the defendant poisoned Genesis and that Genesis died as a result. Members of the jury, you met that burden by asking you to listen to the defendant. So let's walk through what you heard. Today, you first learned that the defendant hated Genesis from the moment they met. And all of that hatred came to a boiling point when Genesis got engaged to the defendant's only son. How did the defendant react? As that wedding approached, as the person he hated the most got closer and closer to taking away his family, he wrote Genesis a note and enclosed $300,000. He tried to tell you today that this note was really some test for Genesis. But if you look at this note, it doesn't say anything about threatening to tell Casey about disapproval. All it says is to take this money and leave. Otherwise, I will take you out of the picture the hard way. And when Genesis didn't leave, the defendant took matters into his own hands. The defense keeps saying that the defendant couldn't have poisoned Genesis because no one saw him do it. But you heard from Mr. Arnold that was all part of the defendant's plan. There weren't any witnesses because the defendant made sure of it. You heard that the defendant cleared out the entire kitchen, made the chefs leave while they were making dinner. Why? He said it was to prepare some wedding gifts. But if that's true, why did he have to be alone with that canister of pesticide and that bottle of wine for Genesis? And when asked what that pesticide was for, he answered it was to kill pests like Genesis. He said this would take care of my problem forever. And then he gave Genesis that poisoned bottle. You heard from Dr. Kwan that when Genesis died, there were just two things in her stomach: the wine from the defendant and a lethal amount of pesticide. Members of the jury, we don't have to wonder if that pesticide came from some other place, because if you look at the test results, you'll see that isofenfis, the pesticide in Genesis's stomach, was the same pesticide found in that bottle of wine from the defendant. Now, the defense told you today that Genesis really got sick because of a bad batch of grapes. Members of the jury, the defense's own witnesses told you that they told their employees to throw out those grapes and that they trusted them to do it. Don't you think if there was really some employee who promised Mr. Martini to throw out those grapes, but didn't, that the defense would have called that person to the stand today? Don't you think we would have heard that employee's name in court? And even if you think there really was some nameless, faceless person that never threw out those grapes, the defense wants you to believe that not a single person tasted that wine before it was bottled. Not the sommelier, not the owner of the winery, not the head winemaker. Members of the jury, Peony Estates makes one wine per year. So we're supposed to believe that this bottle, this all-important bottle for their one wine a year, was never tested before it was given to a customer? That the first person who ever drank that wine was the person the defendant hated the most? Members of the jury, it wasn't a bad batch of grapes. It's a bad excuse by a defendant trying to escape responsibility. Despite all that, the defense would have you believe the defendant is this normal, innocent parent. So ask yourselves, what would a normal, innocent parent do when he learned his son's fiance was in the hospital at 2 a.m? Would he go wake up his son? Would he rush to the hospital himself? Would he ask what happened? Today, you heard the defendant didn't do any of those things. Instead, he went to Genesis's room, found that wine bottle he had given her, and threw it away. He was getting rid of evidence. The defendant wasn't acting like a normal, innocent parent, because he isn't. Members of the jury, in some trials, it's hard to figure out what happened. But not today. Today, the defendant told you what he was going to do, how he was going to do it, and why. Now, all you have to do is listen. Find him liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Mayer.
Closing for the defense, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Members of the jury, the evidence is clear. This case was about a bad batch of grapes, not one bad bottle of wine. Now, on June 8th, 2019, Genesis Petrillo died. She left behind a grieving fiance and a destroyed family business. It was a tragedy. But we are here today because compounding that tragedy, plaintiff brought a civil claim of battery against Mr. Martini, and here's what that actually means. Plaintiff was required to prove to you that this father intentionally poisoned and killed his own son's fiance. Members of the jury, they were required to prove an intentional act. It wasn't their burden today to give you a list of quotes and call it a day. That's all they could do, because they knew this case was really about an accidentally contaminated harvest, not an intentionally poisoned bottle. And it was burden on plaintiff alone to prove to you the opposite. So this case really came down to 3 critical points that plaintiff really just cannot explain away. 1, Mr. Martini would never risk his son or his business. 2, plaintiff's timeline for motive just doesn't add up. And 3, plaintiff didn't prove their theory to be more likely than not. So let's walk through those 3 points because plaintiff cannot reconcile them. Point number 1, plaintiff just came up here and told you that to ask yourselves what an innocent, supportive parent would do. Today, the evidence has shown that an innocent, supportive parent would never risk his son or his business. Now, these two facts alone cause their whole claim to fall apart. Let's start with his son. Today, the evidence has shown that when Mr. Martini gave that bottle to Genesis, it was for the couple to share, for everyone to share, celebrating the new release of the vintage. You heard today on the stand that he was originally going to give it to his son, Casey. Plaintiff needs you to believe that Mr. Martini poisoned a bottle of wine, gave it to Genesis, and then ignored the obvious risk that she might share that bottle with his own son? Members of the jury, ask yourselves, is that logical? It's inconsistent with their theory. Now, this isn't a hypothetical. We had 3 different witnesses from both sides of the case tell you what happened. They testified that when Mr. Martini gave that bottle to Genesis, Genesis started handing out glasses of wine. Plaintiff needs you to believe that Mr. Martini just sat there, watching all of this unfold and simply hoped that his son wouldn't drink enough poison to die. Ask yourselves, is that more likely than not? Which brings me to the second part of this point. Today, the evidence has shown that Cara wine was actually essential to Peony Estates' future success. You learn that Mr. Martini publicly promoted this wine. Sam Arnold, Angel Rodriguez, Blair Osborne, they all told you. Mr. Martini stood on stage with that Cara bottle in front of the whole wedding party, label and all. And Mr. Martini said he got up there and said, Cara wine is going to be the face of Peony Estates. Ask yourselves, is it logical that Mr. Martini would publicly promote this wine, knowing the bad publicity that would soon come from a death by poison? It's not consistent with their theory. One of their quotes is about how Mr. Martini wanted good business. Which brings me to my second point, point number 2. Plaintiff's timeline for motive actually doesn't add up at all. Now, today, plaintiff relied heavily throughout their case on 3 main things: testimony from Sam Arnold on June 7, a collection of statements from Mr. Martini in the weeks before the wedding, and a voicemail that Genesis Petrillo left Mr. Martini, and a note that Mr. Martini followed from that voicemail. But the problem is, members of the jury, all of that evidence occurred after that bottle of wine was corked, sealed, labeled, and put aside. It wasn't defense's burden to prove to you that that bottle was corked. It was plaintiff's burden to refute that fact. And that point went unrefuted. And that means that plaintiff is suggesting Mr. Martini committed a crime before he had the motive that their entire case rests upon. Is that consistent with their theory? Now, of course, there was anger and there was bickering before those 3 main points of plaintiff's case came up. But today, plaintiff is asking you to make a huge and unsupported leap from angry rhetoric, words, to intentional acts of poisoning. Their timeline for motive doesn't add up. Which brings me to my last point, point 3. Plaintiff didn't prove their theory to be more likely than not. Now, as a defense, we didn't have a burden in today's case. We didn't even have to call any witnesses. But today we've shown that there is a logical, simple explanation to how this tragedy actually occurred. It was an accident. Now, first you heard from plaintiff's expert, Dr. Kwan, who told you that pesticide poisoning caused Ms. Petrillo's death. I'm sure you will understand now that the defense agrees with that. But on cross-examination, Dr. Kwan confirmed something that we all already know. He told me that when pesticides are on crops like grapes and they're not properly handled, they can accidentally poison consumers. On cross-examination, he told me he's seen that kind of poisoning, that accidental poisoning, in several different cases. And he clarified that even the smallest amount can kill someone. We heard from Austin Lewis, the winemaker, how the winery usually handles their pesticides. Every year, they throw away the grapes at the bottom of the vineyard that rest in the water that has the most pesticide because it runs down along that slope. They deem those grapes unacceptable because the grapes are sitting in that pesticide water. They throw them away. But members of the jury, what did you learn today? In the year of 2018, the only wine that came out of that was the Cara wine. No one threw those grapes away. It wasn't our burden to prove that, but Austin Lewis didn't throw them away. Harper Martini didn't throw them away, and we learned that oversight was necessary, and Mr. Martini didn't provide it. It's a bad batch of grapes, not a bad bottle. Plaintiff did not meet their burden. We ask that you find Harper Martini not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Steinberg.
Rebuttal, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Not a single person in today's trial could tell you that those grapes weren't thrown out. Not a single person could even tell you if those grapes would even be dangerous. It's not a bad batch. It's a bad excuse. Find him liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Mayer. Is there anything further from either party?
None from the defense, Your Honor.
Very good.
And none from the plaintiff, Your Honor.